Now let's talk about inflation. Inflation is a general increase in the price level. Now, when we say a general increase, this is an average. So, on average, most prices are increasing. Some may be staying constant and some may actually be declining, but on average, prices are increasing. Now, the reason we're concerned about this is because inflation reduces the purchasing power of money, which means that if we have a fixed amount of income, then we can buy less with that income. We measure inflation using the Consumer Price Index, which is a measure of consumer spending, and inflation is calculated as a percentage change in the CPI. So we're going to be using the same percentage change formula that we use for economic growth, calculating economic growth in Chapter 8. So first, though, let's talk about actually how we calculate the CPI. The CPI is a ratio of current year prices to base year prices. So what the government does is the government has determined a market basket that they think represents the typical spending of a family of four. And so what they do is they go out every month and they check the prices of all the items in that market basket and they add them all up and they get the total expenditure for that market basket. Then they calculate the CPI by taking the price of the most recent market basket and they divide it by the market basket expenditure in a base year. And currently the base year is set using an average of prices from 1982 to 1984. So basically, again, the CPI is a ratio of current year prices to base year prices. Then we multiply it by 100 because the CPI is always stated in a base 100. So once we have the CPI, then we can use our percentage change formula. Remember, that is later minus earlier divided by earlier and then multiplied by 100 to put it into a percent. So in this case, we're looking at the CPI from 2007 and 2006. In 2007, the CPI was 207.3, and in 2006, it was 201.6. So later is 2007, earlier is 2006. So we plug that into our percentage change formula, 207.3 minus 201.6, all that divided by 201.6, and then we multiply it by 100 to put it into a percent, and that tells us that the inflation rate from 2006 to 2007 was 2.8%. Let's do a little practice. So remember that we're going to calculate inflation using the percentage change formula. So that's just going to be later minus earlier divided by earlier. And then again, we multiply it by 100 to put it into a percent. So that's what we're working with. So let's calculate inflation. So we're using the CPI, right? So later is going to be 112, earlier is 100, and note that that in the base year, the CPI will always be 100. So that kind of tells you that's the base year. And then we're going to divide that by 100, then we're going to multiply it by 100. So basically, that one's going to come out to 12.5%. Okay, now these two. Okay, so now year 3 and year 2. So later is year 3, earlier is year 2, and that's going to work out to be, looks like that's going to work out to be 7.4%. This is a graph that I pulled from the Bureau of Labor Statistics website that shows some of the most recent inflation data. So you can see, just like Fred, they've got recessions shaded here. So you can see here is what we refer to as the Great Recession. Okay, and you can see that we experienced falling inflation, okay, during that period of time, which is not unusual during a recession. Here is what we're calling the COVID recession. But here's what I wanted to show you. Here's the most recent inflation that we've been experiencing, okay? So it was at its peak, I believe that was in June of 2020, and it's come down now a little bit in December of 2020. But notice that even that peak was, I believe it's somewhere around 9.5%. Okay, so remember this when we talk about the Fed, because we've seen that the Fed does appear to be getting inflation under control. But looking at this most current data, and then I want to go back to some more historical data. So here is some data that I pulled from Fred that shows more historical data. So this goes back to 1960. And so what I wanted to show you was that as much as we've made of inflation over the last year, it is far from the highest inflation we've had. In fact, you can see this time period in the late 70s, early 80s, we had inflation up over 12%. So again, just trying to put things in perspective a little bit there. So there's two basic types of inflation. There's demand pull inflation, and then there's cost push inflation. So demand pull inflation is on the demand side, as the name implies, and we say it's too much spending chasing too few goods. So basically, this is inflation that is spending driven. We're spending, 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 and basically the demand curve is shifting to the right faster than the supply curve can. So that's giving us this inflation, and that's what we think we've been experiencing in this past year, due probably in part to some of the COVID funds that the government paid out to so many people. They gave us money to spend, and we spent it. At other times, when we've seen demand pull inflation, we've associated it with the central bank, with the Federal Reserve, when they're issuing money, when they're increasing the money supply. And again, we'll talk more about that in the last unit. So that's on the demand side. The demand curve is shifting to the right. The cost push inflation, this is on the supply side. And this usually occurs due to an increase in per unit input costs. And it's usually something that we don't expect. So we often refer to these as supply shocks. So something happens, like a natural disaster, perhaps a pandemic. We saw this when at 9/11. It could be a terrorist attack, something that upsets the apple cart per se. And when costs go up, profit goes down. When profit goes down, supply goes down. So whereas with demand pull inflation, we saw that as an increase in demand and the demand curve shifting to the right, with cost push inflation, now we see that as a decrease in supply, and the supply curve is going to shift to the left. Now, in terms of these types of inflation, usually what we see is that the demand pull inflation, again, this can be something that kind of, once the economy gets revved up, this will continue until spending, cools off, until we stop spending so much money. But as long as we keep spending, then we're continuing to push the price level up. But with cost push inflation, it's usually a one and done, because cost push inflation will usually push us into a recession. Now, I will say that it's quite difficult to distinguish which type of inflation we're experiencing when we're in it. This is kind of a hindsight is 2020 experience. But as I mentioned, the types do differ in sustainability. That demand pull will continue as long as spending continues, and that, again, that's what we feel like we've been seeing. Even as the Federal Reserve has been pushing up interest rates pretty aggressively, we still continue to see inflation roaring through the economy, and that's, again, probably because we had a lot of money in savings, and we just were able to keep spending. But cost push, again, tends to be kind of a one and done. Now, there's one other type of inflation that I want to mention, and that is core inflation. So core inflation is calculated without food and energy costs. So the idea would be if we went back and calculated that market basket, but we took all the food items out and we took all the energy items out. Why would we do that? Well, food and energy prices tend to be very volatile, more volatile than the trend. So if we take those out, then we're able to use core inflation for more long-run trend analysis. We take away some of the noise. we're not saying food prices and energy prices aren't important. We're just using this in a slightly different way. This is what we're going to use to determine, okay, what's the long run trajectory of this? And we're doing that again by focusing on those more stable prices. So what are some of the effects of inflation? Well, one of the effects of inflation is we say that it tends to redistribute income. So we want to make a distinction between nominal income and now something we're going to call real income. So nominal income is just what it is. It's your income. It's unadjusted for inflation. So whatever you bring home in your paycheck, that's your nominal income. But then just as we saw with GDP, remember we calculated nominal GDP and then we adjusted it for inflation and then we were able to calculate something we call real GDP. We can do the same thing with income. So real income is going to be your income adjusted for inflation. Because, I mean, let's face it, we understand this. We can't really compare, say, a $50,000 salary from 1950 to a $50,000 salary in 2023. Those aren't comparable salaries, and we understand why, right? Because prices have increased a lot during that time, and again, we go back to that idea of purchasing power. So, again, we're going to be able to calculate that in the same way that we did with GDP by dividing that nominal income by the price index. We're basically going to reset that income into the prices of the base year. We also are going to be making a distinction between anticipated and unanticipated income. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that in a moment. But I also want to point out to you that there's kind of a quick and dirty way of determining, are you keeping up with inflation or is inflation beating you, right? And again, this kind of goes back to that idea of purchasing power. So let's say you got a 5% raise. So that would be your percentage change in your nominal income, right? You got a 5% raise. That's great. You're ecstatic. But if inflation is 7%, like we've been seeing in that range, have you really gained anything? Well, not in terms of purchasing power, right? So we can use this approximation. This is not an equation, this is an approximation. But you can take the percentage change in nominal income, subtract the percentage change in the price level, which is inflation, and that gives you a rough estimate of what your percentage change is in your real income. So again, if you had gotten a 5% raise and inflation was 7%, you actually lost 2% in real income. That doesn't sound so great anymore, does it? And I can speak from experience because this year, all the full-time instructors at NCTC got a 5% raise. Woohoo! But again, we've been experiencing inflation higher than that, so we've actually lost. So we have not been keeping up with inflation. But on the other hand, if you got a 5% raise and inflation's only 2%, then you're still going to net 3%. It's not 5%, but it's still something positive. All right, now let's practice calculating real income using nominal income and the CPI. So let's start with this. $50,000 salary in 1950. In 1950, the CPI was 25. So remember, we're going to calculate real income, and this is just how we did it with GDP as well. Nominal divided by the price index, and then we've got to multiply it by 100 to put it back into whole numbers. So in this case, our real income is going to be our nominal income, which is $50,000, divided by the CPI, which is 25, and we're going to multiply it by 100 to put it back into whole numbers. And so that comes out to 200,000. So remember, what this is doing is this is restating this income into the prices of that base year, which is 1982 to 1984. So we can say that a $50,000 salary in 1950 would have had approximately the same purchasing power as a $200,000 salary would have in 1982 to 1984. Now let's do another one. Now we're going to look at a $50,000 salary in 2015. So once we calculate real income for both of these, then we can compare them. So let's do that. Now our CPI in 2015 is 237. So that's going to work out to be $21,097. Okay, so now that we've converted both of these into real income, we can compare them and we can ask ourselves, okay, who had more purchasing power? The person making $50,000 in 1950 or the person making $50,000 in 2015? Definitely the person making $50,000 in 1950. Now let's do a little practice in converting income into the dollars of another year. So again, here's our formula. We're going to multiply the current year salary by the ratio of the year we're adjusting to and the year we're coming from. So if we want to convert a $75,000 salary in 2015 into $1,950, so we're going to take that salary, $75,000, and we're going to multiply it by the ratio of the year we're adjusting to, which is 1950. So the CPI in 1950 is 25. And then the ratio of the year we're adjusting from, excuse me, the CPI of the year we're adjusting from. So there's our ratio. So that works out to be $7,911. Okay? So what we're saying here is that a salary that was equivalent to $75,000 in 2015, if we were back in 1950, would have been $7,911. Somebody making basically $8,000 in 1950 would have had the same purchasing power as someone making $75,000 in 2015. All right, let's do another one. The purchasing power of a $50,000 salary in 1950 now converted to 2015 dollars. So now we're going to, the ratio is the year we're adjusting to, which is 2015, to the year we're adjusting from, which is 1950. And so that works out to $474,000. So again, what that's telling us is that in order to have the same purchasing power as you would have had in 1950 making $50,000, in 2015 you'd have to make $474,000. So we said we wanted to talk about some of the redistributive effects of inflation. So we want to talk about who's hurt by inflation and who is potentially helped by inflation. So first of all, in terms of who is hurt by inflation, anyone who is on a fixed income. Think about someone who's on some sort of a pension or something that's fixed. If they're on fixed income, then again, when the price level goes up, they can buy less with that fixed income. So they're obviously going to be hurt by inflation. Because what's happening is their real income, which again, now you can kind of think of as a measure of purchasing power, is falling. Savers may also be hurt by inflation because think about it, when you put your money in the bank and you put your money in a savings account and you leave it there, you know, you're going to take it out at some point in the future and you expect the value to be the same, right? Well, let's say that you put $100 in the bank at the beginning of the year, and then you want to go back at the end of the year and get it out. You're still going to get $100, but will it still buy the same amount, right? If we've had significant inflation over the course of that year, the $100 that you take out at the end of the year will buy less stuff than the $100 that you put in at the beginning of the year, right? So savers can be hurt by inflation. Creditors can also be hurt by inflation. Again, because creditors, these are the lenders, right? If you're loaning money to somebody, then they're going to get the full purchasing power when they borrow it and spend it. But because you're getting paid back later, you're going to get paid back in cheaper dollars. Now, we're going to talk in a minute about what creditors can do to cover themselves for this. And this goes back to the idea of anticipated versus unanticipated inflation. So that's who's hurt potentially by inflation. Now, who is unaffected or potentially helped by inflation? Well, anybody who's on a flexible income. So this is anybody who has a cost of living adjustment built in. That's what a cost of living adjustment is. It's usually a clause that states that, you know, if inflation increases, income will increase basically to keep real income constant. Social Security recipients do get a cost of living adjustment every so often, kind of depending on how high inflation's been. Um, and so, that helps them maintain their purchasing power. Union members also will often have a cost of living adjustment built into their union contracts. So, they may have negotiated a 5% raise over the life of the contract, but if they have a cost of living adjustment in there and the inflation rate is 8%, then they're automatically going to get another 3% on top of that, again, to keep them whole, to keep their purchasing power the same. Now, we said that creditors can be hurt by inflation. Debtors may be unaffected by inflation or perhaps even helped, because remember, they're on the other side of this. They're gonna get the full purchasing power of the money when they borrow it and spend it. But then because they're paying it back later, they're paying back the loan with cheaper dollars. So in that way, they could actually be helped by inflation. But again, as I mentioned, there's going to be a way that creditors or lenders are going to try and avoid that. And that comes back to the idea of anticipated inflation. So what happens is that if a lender anticipates inflation, then they're going to try and cover themselves. So when they're loaning money, they have a certain interest rate in mind that's going to make it worth their while, right? Because this is a business. And so they've got a certain interest rate, and we call it the real interest rate, that they have to earn to make it worth their while to make that loan. So what they'll do is they'll take that rate that they need to earn, that real interest rate, and they will add an inflation premium on top of that. So this is how they're going to cover themselves for inflation, so they aren't harmed by inflation. So they will, banks, lenders, they will actually employ economists to help them forecast what they think inflation is going to be, and so they'll add that on top of the real interest rate. So if a lender needs to earn 3% to make it worth their while to make the loan, but they think over the course of the loan the inflation rate is going to be 5%, they're going to add that on top, and they're going to charge you 8%. So the nominal interest rate is what they actually charge. The real interest rate is what they want to end up with, and the inflation premium is how they're going to cover themselves by anticipating inflation. So here you go. Here's another example. If this lender wants to earn 5%, but they think that over the life of the loan, inflation is going to be 6%, they're going to add that 6% on top, and they're actually going to charge 11%. So here we can do a little practice. If the nominal interest rate is 5%, that's what they're actually charging, and the real interest rate is 2%, then what did they add on top of that to get to 5%? The inflation premium would be 3%, right? If the real interest rate is 3% and they think the inflation over the life of the loan is going to be 1%, they're going to add that on top, and they're going to charge 4% as their nominal interest rate. And then if the nominal interest rate is 6%, but 2% of that is the inflation premium, that tells us that 4% is the real interest rate that they want to earn on the loan. Now there's some other issues that come along with inflation that we want to mention. First of all, let's talk about deflation, and we'll come back and talk about this a little bit more later. Deflation obviously is when the prices are falling. And the thing about deflation is we as consumers might look at that and think, ooh, that's a good thing. If prices are going down, yay! But to economists, deflation is actually something we want to avoid. It's considered to be a negative in the macroeconomy. And as I said, we'll come back and talk more about that later, because it tends to cause spending to fall off, and then if spending falls off, we know that GDP can fall off, and that's one of those things that can hamper economic growth. Now, in terms of those effects that we just talked about, people being hurt or not affected or potentially helped by inflation, a lot of times what we see is the effects tend to be really mixed, right? So, you can have families that are savers, so they're potentially hurt by inflation, but they're also borrowers, so they could potentially be helped by inflation. So really, overall, we see mixed effects from this. Um, if they've got a cost of living adjustment, their income may go up. Um, but again, we got lots of different things going on there. Um, and inflation tends to be very arbitrary. It doesn't tend to affect certain groups more than others, like we saw with unemployment. Um, so, even those who have more money to spend feel the pinch when inflation, really gets going like it has been. Now, when we talked about unemployment, we talked about the fact that we could see that unemployment affected output. In fact, we saw that for every 1% in cyclical unemployment, remember that's the unemployment that's associated with a downturn in the economy, we saw 2% decrease in real GDP. So we want to think about, does inflation have that type of output? Does inflation have that kind of effect? Well, going back to those two types of inflation that we talked about, demand pull and cost push. Zeroing in on cost push inflation, we said that was when we have an increase in per unit costs, so supply falls, the supply curve shifts to the left, and we said that can actually be, the sort of thing that pushes us into a recession. So with cost push inflation, we absolutely can see a reduction in real output. We absolutely can see a reduction in real GDP. The other thing to think about is, we said that inflation basically is redistributing income. Well, when we have cost push inflation, it's going to be redistributing a smaller amount, a decreased level of real income. With demand pull inflation, we don't really tend to really think a whole lot about the effect on output. Instead, we tend to think about, okay, what's best, right? What's the ideal level of inflation? And one view is that zero inflation is best. But another view, and the one that's held by most economists, is that mild inflation is best. In fact, the Federal Reserve has a 2% inflation target. In their perfect world, inflation would be 2%. Obviously, it's been a lot higher than that recently, and that's what they're trying to get it back down to 2%. But the reason we say that zero inflation isn't really the best thing goes back to that idea of deflation. And I said that deflation actually can have a negative effect on the economy. Well, if you're at zero inflation, then it can be very easy to, cross the line over into deflation. So having a 2% inflation target kind of gives us a little buffer against that. And the other thing is that kind of helps keep us moving forward. But again, right now, we're a long way from that. What we're not experiencing, however, thank goodness, is what we call hyperinflation. This is extraordinarily rapid inflation. It's the type of inflation that devastates an economy. So what we're talking about here is when prices are changing daily, if not hourly, right? So when that happens, businesses don't know what to charge from one day to the next. It gives a lot of uncertainty to an economy. So businesses don't know what to charge. Consumers don't know what's a fair price. And so, if this goes on long enough, money becomes worthless. We've had different examples of this throughout history. If you're a student of world history, you may be aware that this happened in Germany after World War I. There were stories of people, carrying around their money in wheelbarrows just to buy a loaf of bread. We've also seen this in other countries as well. And one country that we've seen this in is Zimbabwe. They experienced hyperinflation in 2008. And we've also seen it in Argentina and Venezuela. In fact, here is a video about Zimbabwe to kind of give you an idea of what happened.
It's not easy being a dictator. For one, there's a lot of other people around you who would love to be you, so you're constantly worrying about staying in power. Navigating the gray area between political rivals and political allies is a total headache. Plus, there's all those pesky people who you're supposed to be in charge of. How to give them as little as possible without inciting rebellion is a never-ending balancing act. Robert Mugabe, the president of Zimbabwe, was facing these problems around 2000. He needed money to bribe his enemies and reward his allies. Unfortunately, he had taxed pretty much everything there was to tax, and his policies had scared away investors. The economy wasn't doing well, and his people were unemployed and hungry. So, where to get the money? Well, one of the perks of running a country is that you get your very own money-making machine, the printing presses. So, in a pinch, you can just print more money, which is exactly what Mugabe did. The newly printed money didn't increase productivity in the Zimbabwean economy, and there was no new investment, so the economy couldn't produce more goods. In effect, you had more money chasing the same goods. More money chasing the same goods meant that the purchasing power of the Zimbabwean dollar fell. You needed more dollars to buy the same stuff as before. In other words, as the newly printed money began flooding the market, prices began to rise. Prices began to increase at a rate of about 50% a year, and that was only the beginning. As prices rose, the government had to print even more money to buy just as many goods as before. And so they did. And that is how things got out of control. The faster prices rose, the more money the government printed. And the faster prices rose. A feedback loop. By 2001, prices were rising at a rate of 100% per year. By 2002, 200% per year. 2003, 600% per year. By 2006, prices were rising at over 1,000% per year, and it cost 417 Zimbabwean dollars to buy toilet paper. No, not per roll, $417 per sheet. Money was devaluing so quickly that the money you had in the morning would be worth quite a bit less by the evening. So people were trying to get rid of currency as soon as they got it. Zimbabweans became millionaires, but unfortunately, $1 million Zimbabwe dollars might buy you a chicken, if you were lucky. And still the government kept printing money, and in higher and higher denominations. $1 million notes, 100 million, 10 billion, $100 billion notes. In 2008, prices started rising by thousands of percent a month, and the government started printing $100 trillion notes. At the height of this feedback loop, prices were increasing at an astronomical rate of 7.6 billion% a month, and $1 would get you, well, we're not sure how to say it, but this many Zimbabwean dollars. By the end of 2008, the Zimbabwean dollar had effectively ceased to exist, and Mugabe had no choice but to legalize transactions in foreign currencies. The Zimbabwe hyperinflation was over. Hyperinflations have occurred in other countries such as Yugoslavia in 1994, China in 1949, and Germany in 1923. As in Zimbabwe, these hyperinflations were caused by governments that were desperate for cash, but with few means to raise funds except the printing presses. The Zimbabwe hyperinflation also illustrates a more general principle that we will be exploring and testing in greater detail in upcoming videos, and that is inflation is caused by increases in the supply of money. You're on your way to mastering economics. Make sure.
So as I mentioned, we saw this in Zimbabwe, and we've also seen this in Venezuela more recently. You'll see this headline here says they stopped counting their money and they started weighing it. So you start to understand what we mean when we say that hyperinflation can be absolutely devastating for an economy.